Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing 52 weeks of Python. We are currently in week number 52. That's right, we've made it to the end of all of the scheduled weeks. I will probably be adding a summary or review or something of that type. But yeah, if you've made it this far, then congratulations to you. I think that you can definitely consider yourself a software developer at this point, because we've talked about so many different things, including databases, messaging, RESTful APIs, applications that you write to display data and print data, including dictionaries and lists and all the other stuff, monitoring using all this networking functionality, including stuff that does JSON and YAML, etc. We've got our message handling that we've got, where we're doing multi-threading stuff to do this. We've got multi-threaded stuff doing monitoring, etc. So yeah, you should be congratulated if you've made it this far. You definitely are in the domain of people who absolutely understand how to develop software and all the different aspects of it. So congratulations to you. In this lesson, we are talking about what's in red here. That would be the RESTful APIs to support the user interface. I've made modifications to those since the first lesson on messaging that we talked about, so pay attention to that. And also the user interface code. That's the JavaScript / HTML / React / Material UI, etc. stuff that brings us user interfaces like this. And what we've done is we've added functionality in the form of these actions. So you can do traceroutes now, you can do portscans on hosts, and this actually ends up launching dialogues that we haven't seen before, and so you get to see the capabilities that exist in the language to help this to happen. You can see our little worker here working hard to deliver the information in the form of this portscan, and over here in the form of this traceroute. So that's what we will be going over. Hopefully it will be of interest to you, and you will know a lot more about how this user interface stuff works at the end of the lesson. So let's get started. Okay, so let's get started talking about the user interface that I've built to go along with this messaging functionality that we've been discussing. That messaging functionality, if you recall, was implementing portscan in previous lessons. I had only done portscan. I have added traceroute to that functionality, and I'll demonstrate that in just a minute. But so now we have portscan and traceroute. The code that we will be looking at is going to be the code that implements the endpoints, which have changed a little bit. I know that we looked at it in previous sessions, but there's going to be code that has been modified that we'll look at. And the main thing that we'll be looking at, I don't know if it's the main thing, but the significant portion would be looking at the user interface code that implements actions. That is, the stuff that we've seen before in the user interface realm has been mainly displaying stuff, but we're actually going to perform actions. So that is what we will be looking at. So let's demonstrate what this looks like. So right here I have my Quokka worker running. I have Quokka, the server, running in the background, and it's happily handling get requests, put requests, etc. I don't have my monitoring running at the moment, so I'm just letting that not run. It's not really necessary for the stuff that we're doing. And of course I have the user interface code where I did an npm start to get the user interfaces going. I do have two user interfaces up. You can see both of these. Probably in the real world, unless you have more monitors than you need, you wouldn't have multiple of these up at the same time, because of course you can just use the one screen and bounce between devices and hosts and services and whatnot. But that's what I'm doing here, just because it looks kind of cool and because I want to invoke both of these at once. Now the difference here from the Quokka project that I did is I have one Quokka worker. If we remind ourselves of the picture, let me pull this up again. We have one Quokka worker that listens to requests in this message queue, and there's one message queue into which port scan requests and traceroute requests, and ultimately capture and whatever else we might add would be added to this queue. So there's one worker, and what it does is it spawns or creates and launches a thread to do the work that's required. So if it's a port scan request, it launches a thread, it goes and does its thing, it reports the results, and then it goes away. And so that is what this thing is down here. You can see right here, I probably didn't do this obviously enough, but it's actually working, waiting for messages. This stuff right here is from, as you can kind of see, the traceroute thread. So I started a traceroute going. In fact, if we were to look at this traceroute thread, it got started, so it's starting the traceroute. The worker went back to listening for messages, okay? And now this output is going to be all traceroute thread output about the traceroute that it did, and then it completed, as you see down there. So we're still waiting for messages. It's a little bit, it's intermixed, the messages, but we are the output, but we are waiting for messages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch both of these simultaneously, as close to simultaneously as I can. And what I'm going to ask you to do, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to shrink these a little bit. So the main purpose of shrinking those is just so that you can observe stuff going on here. So what you're going to see is that there will be a port scan request, and then there will be a traceroute request. So why don't I get that started? There's my port scan request, and here is a traceroute request. So you can see that it's gotten the information. It actually has completed both of those, and the user interfaces are just waiting for the response. I know that's hard to see, but you've seen this before. This is a traceroute output, and this right here is going to be, this is a port scan output, and this over here is the traceroute output. And so that is what the user interface looks like. Let me make these big again. Okay, so here we are back with these being a little bit more readable, and so I just want you to observe what's going on here. We'll use this as the example. What I've got is I've got an extra column in my table. The extra column I've labeled actions internally. It's also called actions that I'm going to be taking, and I have these icons, and in this little teeny tiny text that I never figured out how to make bigger. I may need to spend a little bit of time and look into that, but it says extended scan for open ports. And so what's going to happen is when not only is this visually going to be on the screen, but it's a button that I can then click. What's going to happen is I'm going to actually create a dialog box. As you can see, I've started the work going, and it's completed, and now I'm waiting to retrieve it. Now I've retrieved it, and here is the output. I'm displaying it in there. So the question is, this is a lot more work than what we've done when we've just been presenting a table here. So we've got a button, we've got an action that's getting taken, we've got the initial launching of the port scan and the printing of this table. We're waiting to retrieve the results, and then eventually we're going to be putting this up there. So there's actually a fair number of moving parts on the user interface side. So that is what we will be looking into. So let's look at the code that implements this functionality. Now our first stop is going to be looking at this code. That's our Python code running inside Flask that is implementing the REST API. I know that we looked at it in previous lessons, and in the first one I even called it the endpoints, but I have changed the endpoints a little bit and I've added some of them, so I do want to take a look at that. So that's what we're going to look at next. So here we are in Quokka server. Remember, that is our Flask application. If I go to the top here, you can see all the Flask stuff going on. So remember, at the beginning we had hosts, endpoint, devices. Actually, I didn't call them that. I just called it hosts. and devices and services, and that was nice and handy. But then I started wanting to use the word hosts elsewhere and devices elsewhere, and I ended up with collisions in names, and PyCharm was complaining about it. So since this doesn't really matter, the name is not used anywhere, nothing calls it explicitly, the REST API comes in here via this URL portion, and so we can call it whatever we want. I just appended endpoint to all of these. I'm not sure if overall that's a good idea or not, but it certainly gets rid of little warnings that we see. So that's the hosts, devices, and services. And now we've looked at this before. I had host/scan before, but I've simplified this or made it broader to call it just scan. And the reason for that is, of course, we can do port scans on not only hosts, but also on the devices that we would have in the network. I don't actually do that because I think probably Cisco might complain a little bit if I'm running port scans on their networking devices. I suspect that I wouldn't even be able to have my traffic get out of my own network to go there because it would hit my router. But even if I could, it probably would be a bad idea. But we can scan technically anything, so I took host away from that. I also simplified it. Since I got rid of that, I don't actually go and check to see if the host is there. And I changed the name of this thing that was host to target, and that's what we use in other areas, specifically in traceroute. So I just changed the name of it. There's nothing really functionally different there. Everything else is the same with this get and the post, etc. And this is my worker port scan for getting the port scans back. And I recently, since you saw this last, I have added traceroute. So traceroute functionality, I did the same thing that I did with portscan, which is on the initiation of this stuff. I leveraged code from the Quokka project. So you can see here in my worker APIs, here's where I started the portscan. You'll remember this code here. The only thing different in this code, I believe, is that I'm renamed host to target. Now, in addition to portscan, I have traceroute. So traceroute is going to be functionally pretty much the same. One of the main differences is my payload is going to be different. But other than that, I'm going to be sending a message. Probably would be possible for me to write a utility function that would do this. Since I'm doing it in two different locations, this would be a case where I would be able to remove duplication of code. I possibly will do that in the near future, but that is my worker APIs. And if you recall, this gets called in our Quokka server when the user does a post. So we start traceroute, it's the same as this start port scan. I really didn't want to go into this in any great detail because we've already seen it, but I just wanted to point out that I have simplified it a little bit, gotten rid of some extra stuff, and added traceroute since you saw this last. So for our next stop, we're going to look at the user interface. Remember, the user interface is this thing. It's implemented using HTML, but mainly JavaScript running inside it. It's using the React framework material UI look and feel, and then my JavaScript and HTML code that goes inside of it. So we'll be looking at that. Just to remind ourselves, what are we talking about? We've evolved our application from just displaying this output to actually taking input. So we're going to be putting buttons up here. We're going to be reacting to a click in the button. We're going to be popping up a window. We're going to be initiating the traceroute in this situation, fetching the results, and then printing it up, and then closing it down when we're done with it. And the same would be true if we were doing port scan on the host screen or what have you. So that is what we will be talking about. Now let's go into our IDE and look at the code that actually implements this. So I'm in hosts here. By the way, just as an aside, I mentioned last time that I started to use Visual Studio Code because it's free. I originally have shown you stuff in WebStorm, and that I have to say is a preferable solution in terms of functionality. I did discover that even though I do like WebStorm a bit, it doesn't show you all of your syntax and sometimes semantic errors that might be in your code, so it doesn't really do the same stuff that it does, but it is nicely color coded and it allows you to organize things. So that's what I'm going to be using here. So we are here in our host JavaScript file. This is the same file that we displayed this table before, so no difference there, but we're going to be augmenting it. So let's look chronologically based on what it is that we're doing in this situation in order to figure out what exactly is going on. So in order to do that, we're going to ignore some of the stuff that I added here, and we're going to go down to our material table. So the question is, how do I actually put buttons onto the screen that will result in actions being taken? And so the good news is down here, not only can I specify the data, which is where the host data comes from, not only can I specify these options, which is where I colorize stuff. I think I talked about that last time. But I can also specify actions, and these actions are what is going to happen when somebody actually clicks on a button that is provided in the screen. And so here I'm able to specify what is the icon that I want you to use. This thing called policy rounded icon, that's for hosts. Let me go to the host screen. That apparently is the policy rounded icon that I chose from Google. My tooltip that was so small you couldn't read it. But if I hover over it, then it says extended scan for open ports. I'll figure out at some point how to make that to be readable. And then here's where it says, because this is an action type of thing, it says when somebody clicks it, what do we want to do? Now here's a construct that you'll see periodically in the React framework. It's a JavaScript thing, and it's basically saying I want you to take this data. So this is like parameters that get passed into my function. We're not going to dive deep into this, and I want you to execute this code. The things in curly braces is code that's going to be executed. And as I say, I just want to pause here. This is JavaScript mixed in with HTML, and we're not doing a deep dive in order to understand it here. I just want you to get the high-level understanding of what's going on. What are we going to do when somebody clicks? Well, we're going to call this function called render extended port scan dialog, and we're going to pass in the host name. So for whatever row we're on, depending on the row that we happen to be on, it's going to pass in the appropriate host name, and that is what's end up going to get sent down to where we're sending it. Now if I was using WebStorm, I'd do a Control-B to go to render extended port scan dialog, but I don't recall what I'm doing in order to get there. So I'm going to scroll up, and here I see it. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to initiate in extended port scan. Remember, I'm calling this extended port scan. Well, I don't know if you would remember it. I don't remember saying it in this. If you've been following along with the Quokka walkthrough, there are two types of port scans. One is a simple, trivial, maybe it's not so trivial, but it's just a TCP port scan, which doesn't require sudo or any of the other stuff, and it doesn't do as deep of a scan as the extended one does. So what we're doing is this thing that I can't remember if I called it this. Yeah, I think I called it this in Quokka, so I'm calling it the same thing here, extended port scan. Don't get caught up in that. And I'm going to pass in the host ID. The host ID in this situation, I'm just realizing, is an error. Did you notice that? What am I passing in from my button? I'm passing in the host name. And in my Quokka product, I'm actually, let's see, where is it? In my Quokka product, I pass in the host name. And so what we're going to see probably is when we go initiate extended port scan, when I'm passing in the host ID, that's going to be used as the host name. So let's go take a look at this. But before we do, let's just say, okay, what am I doing? I'm going to do this thing right here, which is to set my state for this variable called open extended portscan dialog to true. And so I'm basically going to be setting this value to true, and the way that we define dialogues, I'm going to look at that in just a minute, but basically we define the dialog down here at the bottom. This is how you do these. Here's my dialog, and what you do is we decide whether to open it based on this variable, open portscan dialog. If it's false, then it won't get opened. If it's true, it will get opened. So basically in this screen, when there's nothing here, the dialog is actually there, it's defined, it's just not open. And it's not until I click on this that open gets set to true and it begins to show that. All right, let's go back to where we were, which was rendering. And this is where we call initiate extended portscan. And this is, as I was saying, I believe that this is a bug. And if it's not, I'm probably going to re-record this and you'll never hear it. So if you're hearing it, then I noticed that it was a bug and I just decided to keep this because then you can see that, even the vaunted, tremendous guy named Chuck has errors in his code. And sure enough, initiate extended portscan, I'm receiving the host name. So let's come down here and fix this. All right, so I'm going to call this host name. And that means I need to come down here and change this to host name. And probably I should come here and say portscan host, I want to display host name as well. And you know what? In this version, I'm not even passing in the IP address. Let's go down to our render extended portscan dialog down here under actions. And notice I'm only passing in one parameter, the host name. So let's fix this up as well. Render extended portscan dialog, I'm going to just get rid of that. So there, you've seen us fixing a bug. Now normally I would stop everything and restart this. Actually, you know what? Let's do that. I've made this modification. Now it's telling me that I've made changes, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this up first so you can see it. This is going to be sitting right here in the corner, just so you get a little bit of an idea. And keep your eye on that when I do. Actually, I'll come up here and say save. I'll go ahead and save all. See how that says now it's compiling? It's recompiling everything, and what you're going to see is when it's done compiling, if I didn't make any errors, then this will say it's okay, and this will pop back to the original thing. Now we're going to go to hosts, and hopefully hosts is still alive, and that screen looks okay. And now I'm going to do, let's do a port scan. Let's have a look. Notice this, it's actually giving me the name of the thing. Before that was blank, so that was a bad thing before. Okay, so we've made a decent fix, and this is actually showing that there's a few ports open on this device. There's a lot of stuff going on that device. It is actually, I'm not sure I should be showing this to you, but it's my wife's phone. We just scanned my wife's phone. She's not at work today, so she happens to be here. Yeah, and you can see she has a Pixel 3a XL. That's her phone. I'm not going to look at any more stuff, but you get the idea. So we made a bug fix. How exciting! And kind of embarrassing for me that I had it there, but it's good to see it. Let's continue with our discussion. Okay, I showed you how the dialog box pops up. The really important thing, though, is this one right here, the statement before it, which is where I'm calling this function or this method called initiate extended portscan. And that is where the magic is going to happen in terms of causing our Quokka server to receive the post request and to begin to launch the port scan through the message broker and the Quokka worker, etc. And so this is what gets the whole thing started. This is initiate extended port scan. So what's going to happen is the first thing that we do is we set the results. This is just to help the screen, the people looking at the screen, to know that we're initiating the scan. Remember, we are making requests here to a different web service. Our web service is our Quokka server. So we're no longer getting information from this thing that you see over here. Remember, that's just serving up the web page frameworks. The actual data that goes into it is coming from elsewhere. And this is where I'm building the URL to make this request. I remember I used to have host/scan. I've changed that to just scan, and I've changed host name to target. So I say target equals, and then that's going to be, in this situation, the host name. If I'm doing it from other, not from hosts, if I was going to be doing a scan of a service or of a device, then I would have the device name or the service name. So basically, I've made target be the universal word for that. This is my URL, and then I'm going to set my method equal to post, and then I'm going to say fetch. And this is that asynchronous request. If you recall from my discussion of user interface, what's going to happen is this request is made, and it's a little bit like the yield function in generators. It starts something and then it stops in the middle and goes back, and then at a later point in time it will resume right in the middle, and that's what happens here. It launches this request, which is going to go to our Quokka server. When the response comes back, that's when this .then is executed. So basically we go away after the fetch, and when it's complete, when we've gotten a response back, then we get the JSON out of it, and we use that as the data, and we set the token, which is what we got back. Remember, the token gets returned to us so that we can then turn around and make a request with that token. And so we set the token equal to the appropriate value. Then we say fetch extended port scan results. That's where I come down here. This is the method where I'm actually going to wait for the response to come back. So visually here, when I click on this particular one, at this point I've initiated it. It says, and now I'm going and retrieving it. So I've got my token, and I've said go get that data back, and we're waiting for this port scan to complete. Eventually it completes, and we have this data and we print it out, and that is what is going to happen here. I'm going to set up my URL, which says I'm going to do a get instead of a post this time. I'm going to pass in both the target, which is the host name, and the token, which is the token that I saved from the previous request. Remember, I saved it right here, token. I set token, the state token, to the data.token. And then I do a get. When it returns, I get the JSON data, and I'm going to set extended port scan results equal to that data. And then I'm pretty much done. I just log it. And what ends up happening is, if we look down here, we'll look at the insides of that dialog box, because that's the last thing that we have to look at here. This is the dialog box. Remember, open will be true as soon as we initiated it, open was true. Guess what's going to happen when I click on this? When I click on this, open is going to become false. That's what my close does. In fact, on button, I say handle close extended port scan dialog. Let's just go look at that. Handle extended port scan dialog. Guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to set open dialog to false. That will cause the dialog box to go away. It's still there in the memory of the browser. The browser knows about its existence. It's just not displaying it. Let's look at what this does. We don't have to worry too much about this. This is mainly HTML. I've got a dialog title. I've got dialog content. Here I'm saying the output is, I'm doing some breaks in here. The result, the extended scan results, I'm using this pre-tag. Basically, if you're a little bit familiar with HTML, that says this has already been pre-formatted. Please don't do anything with it. That's why when it gets oops, when it gets printed out, where did it go? That's why when it gets printed out, let me try this one for a change. We'll see the result come back in a minute. When we see it get printed out here on this screen, if I didn't say that it was already pre-formatted, it would nicely put all of this in one line because that's how HTML works. But because the output that I've got is already been formatted, if you recall in my P format call that did like basically a pretty print of this, then it allows it to be printed in this nice manner. And that, my friends, is how this works. That's for host table. If we were to go to services, you would see that it's fundamentally going to be the same thing. I have this open traceroute dialog, whereas before, in fact, here, hosts, let me split to the right, and let me get rid of this so you can see it a little bit better. So you can see here I have a bunch of dialog things over here. I have a bunch of dialog things here. That's new. I have my open extended portscan dialog, open traceroute dialog. I have these target results, etc. If we come down here in my services, I have initiate traceroute and fetch traceroute results in the same way that I have initiate portscan and initiate extended portscan results. Down here you'll see I have render traceroute dialog, and down here we looked at render extended portscan dialog, and down here we had the actions, and down here we have actions, and then we have our dialog down here for traceroute, and down here we have a dialog as well. Now here, one thing that's different, here I had formatted text that I use this pre for. Here, remember traceroute is that pretty picture. I'm using the img tag, which stands for image, and I tell it where my image is. If you look, let's see, let me do a traceroute just so that you can see this, and then we'll be pretty much done. I'm going to come here. Let's get my Google traceroute. You can see this. What you're going to see is it's going to be, this is basically the binary image that you see up here, but it's put into byte format. So I have to do a few gyrations in order to get binary data, because you can't pass binary data in HTTP. I need to get it into this byte format. And so I do that, and when it gets passed back, it comes back here and it's in the byte format, and this is how I say this is where the data is that you're not really looking for. The details of how you do this stuff in HTML, but that is kind of the basics of what it is. And there you go. That's the user interface on top of all of this messaging data. Let's go back to our picture just to remind ourselves. This is what we were talking about. This is how the user interface exercises those APIs that we built to cause the messaging down below, which we didn't even look at in this lesson. All that messaging stuff is actually happening and working quite well behind the scenes for us. We just looked at the user interface piece that helped us, our user interface, turn from something that is purely output based, which would be everything to the right here, to actually allowing input in the form of somebody clicking a button. Okay, let's review what we talked about. Remember, we're talking about messaging, and actually in this lesson we didn't talk specifically about messaging. We talked about the user interface that was driving functionality that actually utilizes the messaging capability. And so we looked at the ability in the services table that I added to do a traceroute. In the host table, what I added was the ability to do extended port scan. We did talk about the RESTful API functionality and how I modified and tightened what we did on the Python side of things. And then we spent some time in the user interface where the bulk of what we were talking about was going on. And in there we talked about the capability that we had for adding the buttons that you see on the screen, adding responses to when somebody clicks the button and pops up a dialog, how we create the dialog and leave the dialog up, and probably most importantly, the functionality related to actually initiating the traceroute, which is a post that we send to our web API, our RESTful API on our web service, our Quokka web service. And then later, once that's done, doing the fetching of the results where we do a get, and that sits there waiting for the data to come back, and eventually we print it out like you see right here. So that is what we talked about. Hopefully it made sense to you. If it didn't, as always, please send me a note or let me know in some manner. And yeah, thanks for listening.